Okay, so next we're going to think about this thing called the Coase theorem, which has to do with all these property rights issues. So to think about what the Coase theorem says, we're going to kind of go through a thought experiment. Okay, so think about two adjacent farmers that don't have a fence between their properties. One of the farmers is raising cattle and the other is growing wheat. Now think about one scenario that could possibly happen. The cattle rancher is liable for damages that the cows cause to the wheat farmer's crops, right? So since there's no fence, the cows can easily cross over onto the wheat farmer's property and potentially destroy some of his crops. Well, if that's the case, there are some options for the cattle rancher, right? He can either put up a fence and prevent his cattle from crossing onto the wheat farmer's land, damaging his crops. So that's one option. Or the other option is to simply pay for the damages that his cows cause. Now, which option will he choose? Basically, whichever one costs less. So if it costs less to put up a fence, he or she would do that. If it costs less to just pay for the damages, he or she would do that instead, right? Exactly. So just considering the costs and taking the course of action of the lower cost option. Now, there's another scenario, potentially. Suppose that the wheat farmer doesn't have a legal claim or a legal right to cattle-free fields. So there's some options for the farmer. Put up a fence, or just accept some occasional damage from the cattle. So what are the results of this? If the property rights are fully specified, either the cattle rancher or the wheat farmer will build the fence, right? And so basically, what we're seeing is, let me before we continue here, let me explain that a little bit more. What we're seeing is that in the first scenario, the wheat farmer has clearly defined property rights over his land and crops. It's his right to have cattle-free farmland. In the second scenario, he doesn't have the right, and the cattle rancher actually has the right to, in some sense, to the wheat farmer's land, which is a bit strange and unorthodox. Not how things usually work, but that's the case. So in one case, the farmer has clear property rights over his crops. In the other case, the cattle rancher has clear property rights over the wheat farmer's crops. But in either case, basically the same thing ends up happening. Either a fence is built if that's the lower cost solution, or just taking some damage to the crops is the solution if it's lower cost. So let's just assume that the fence is the lower cost option, right? In both cases, that's what would happen. A fence would be built. Whether the cattle owner has rights to the wheat crop fields or the wheat farmer has rights to the wheat crop field, the same thing happens, and it's just whatever is the most efficient solution, right? So if the fence is lower cost, then that's the efficient solution, and that will be the solution whether whoever owns the property rights, whoever has the property rights. And that's basically what the Coase theorem is getting at. It's saying that as long as the property rights are defined, it doesn't matter who owns the property, the efficient solution will come to fruition. Okay. So this is kind of a nice theorem because it says that anytime we have an externality, all we really need to do is create clearly defined property rights, and it ultimately doesn't matter how we allocate them. As long as we define them and they're clear, the market will take us to an efficient solution. Okay, so that's exactly what the Coase theorem is. If there are no barriers to negotiation, and if property rights are fully specified, the interested parties will bargain to correct the externality. Okay, so that's what we're talking about here.